Hello and welcome to the U.S. History Underground. As always, Mr. Zagari and I are coming to you from the high school podcast studio. How are you doing today, Zags?
I'm doing great. We are sitting here in a rather warm room while the rest of the building is freezing cold out here on our 2-hour delay.
Well, that's a little primary source right there, right? Time and place.
There we go.
Nice.
Absolutely. So I'm excited, Mr. O'Hagan. We have a great topic for our podcast listeners today that spans a few chapters and offers us some insight into the present day debates we see between Republicans, especially with Donald Trump and his supporters, and the Democrats.
Right you are, Zags, because today on the podcast, U.S. foreign policy in the Gilded Age. So our focus today is U.S. foreign policy from about 1890 through 1920. That's really the second half of the Gilded Age, and it culminates with the end of World War I. This period was crucial as it marked a transformation from isolationism to a more interventionist stance for the U.S. Zags, how about some context to start us off?
You got it, Mr. O'Hagan. Well, let's first remember that George Washington's farewell address set the template for U.S. foreign policy. He warned the new nation to steer clear of permanent alliances, and his advice was neutrality.
Now, that's different from isolation, Zags. Remember that George Washington knew we'd have to trade in order to grow, but he wanted to keep us out of political drama that European nations always seem to be engaged in. Isolation would also cut you off from an economic relationship.
Precisely. Washington feared that we were still too weak to get involved in European fights would only lead to bruises and broken bones for us, metaphorically speaking, of course.
The Monroe Doctrine builds on that neutrality, but that takes it a step further, right?
Sure does. In 1823, Monroe re-emphasized the U.S. as a neutral player, but also declared that any European intervention in the Americas would be seen as an act of aggression. Washington didn't tell the Europeans to stay out of the Western Hemisphere, but Monroe does. That difference might be why so many people mistakenly equate Monroe's policy with isolation, but it's still encouraging the Europeans to trade.
And Monroe has some of the same concerns as George Washington, that America still is on equal footing with the European powers and is more likely to get trampled if there's a fight that we get dragged into. So Washington and Monroe's standard is held for almost the entire 19th century. So what changes, Zags? Why do we see a departure from this policy of neutrality?
It all goes back to technology and industrialization, Mr. O'Hagan. It's the catalyst for all of these actions. Obviously, the entire domestic character of America changes because of the growth of the railroads, factories, cities, and the influx of immigrants coming into the country. But that growth also encourages the U.S. to be more outward-looking. Big business needs, wants new markets for the goods being produced. It wants more sources for raw materials.
So it's fair to say that neutrality, which was really an answer to the question, how do we ensure national security, had become passé. We're bigger, stronger. We don't need to be neutral anymore because we need to defend ourselves. We can defend ourselves. We can play with the big boys. We can play by the same rules the Europeans play by.
And I would interject there and say, I think that the War of 1812 kind of proved that, coming Monroe's in the wake of that war, that rise of nationalism.
Right, and whether it really did is maybe debatable, but,
sure.
But the perception was that
100%.
That's very true.
Yep. Well, I think you're spot on with that. And what we're also going to see is the Spanish-American War was sparked by this U.S. intervention in Cuba's struggle for independence from Spanish rule. The sensationalist journalism of the time, yellow journalism, played a crucial role in rallying public support for the war, and newspapers exaggerated reports of Spanish atrocities, fueling American sentiment for intervention. So are we seeing the media and the ideas of the media being influential to people as we do today?
There's no doubt. No doubt. And that Spanish-American War you mentioned is, that's starting in 1898. So truly Monroe's warning to Europeans not to cause trouble in the Western Hemisphere made that intervention in Cuba an easy decision.
Right. I mean, Monroe's warning was more bluster than anything, but an industrialized America we could back it up now. One major impact of this war was the acquisition of several territories. The U.S. gained Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, transforming the nation into an overseas empire. Let's not forget that America was always in the expansion business. Just think Manifest Destiny.
Right.
But this marked a shift from continental expansion to imperialism.
And the acquisition of the Philippines was particularly significant. It allowed the U.S. to establish a foothold in Asia and expand its influence in the Pacific. However, this also led to the Philippine-American War, as Filipino nationalists resisted American control, believing that they had fought for their independence from Spain, only now to be under the thumb of the Americans.
And I'm not going deep in the weeds here, but that sounds like a precursor to something that the U.S. will be involved in the late 50s, 60s, and into the 70s.
There is no doubt that there's a lot of parallels between the Filipino War and Vietnam, but we digress.
Yes.
Let's stick with the Spanish American War.
I know. Okay, so the war also changed U.S. foreign relations. Previously, the U.S. had maintained a relatively isolationist stance, focusing on domestic issues. The victory in the Spanish-American War signaled to the world that the U.S. was willing to engage militarily and politically on an international scale.
Yeah, and I think this newfound assertiveness was really codified by Roosevelt's corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. I'm talking about Teddy Roosevelt.
Right. Walk softly, carry a big stick.
Right. And it really did try to justify U.S. intervention in Latin America. The war and its aftermath demonstrated the U.S.'s commitment to protecting its interests and maintaining stability in the Western Hemisphere. TR even refers to the U.S. as policeman of the Western Hemisphere, asserting that the U.S. would intervene in Latin America to maintain stability.
And that corollary also sought to justify the construction of the Panama Canal. It was completed in 1914 and drastically reduced travel time for military and commercial ships. The U.S. supported Panama's independence from Colombia to secure control over the canal zone, directly injecting itself into the political affairs of its neighbors.
So Europe should take Monroe at his word and stay out, but we don't need to heed our own advice.
Well, what's that old phrase associated with hypocrisy? Do as I say, not as I do.
I guess we really did think we could play by the rules of the Europeans then, right?
And our policy continues to evolve away from neutrality under President William Howard Taft. He embraced the concept of dollar diplomacy, which aimed to use economic power to influence countries in Latin America and East Asia instead of military intervention. The idea was to promote American financial interests abroad.
Economics really moves the needle in these discussions.
Sure.
That's such a strong commentary on how the power of industrialization in this era really impacted our foreign policy concerns and decisions.
Absolutely. And we see that again with Taft's successor, Woodrow Wilson, as he shifted to a policy what he called moral diplomacy that prioritized moral values over imperialism, which is reminiscent of that progressive ideology that we saw domestically now being applied to an international level.
Right.
It involved offering support to countries that shared the United States' democratic values. Wilson believed that moral diplomacy would help developing nations become self-sustaining and democratic.
But it still embraces a political interventionist spirit that would have made Washington and Monroe cringe, don't you think?
No doubt, 100%. Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson differed on the how of intervention. They weren't asking, should we intervene, though?
Hold on, Zags. There is certainly some backtracking on Wilson's part when it comes to intervention in World War I. Why did he freeze up on that one if there seems to be this really strong sentiment of American involvement?
Well, the first part of that answer has to do with where the intervention is taking place. Remember that all these interventions we've mentioned previously are in Central America and the Caribbean. Even the Philippines and Hawaii, while clearly out of our hemisphere, are still a good distance from the Europeans. World War I is a totally different story, though. This would have required intervention on the continent in the home countries of Europe's great powers. This is
that's a
total shift.
That's a good point, Zach. But Teddy Roosevelt called for American involvement in the First World War almost immediately. So with Wilson advocating neutrality, was he having second thoughts, do you think?
I think most Americans realized that stepping into European affairs on the continent was way beyond any of the things we had done previously. Wilson clearly, as the sitting president, did not have the political support to get involved. As a former president, Teddy Roosevelt didn't have the political considerations to concern himself with. Wilson wanted to be involved, but was fearful of the political costs.
And as the war progressed and German submarines sank American ships and British propaganda did a number on the Central Powers, Wilson shifted his stance. He goes to Congress emphasizing the need to make the world, and I quote, safe for democracy.
And let's not forget that Wilson's vision extended beyond the war. After the U.S. entered World War I in 1917, he proposed the League of Nations in his 14 points, which aimed to prevent future conflicts through collective security. Although the League was established, the U.S. Senate ultimately rejected joining it. This decision reflected a return to isolationist sentiments after the war, illustrating the complex nature of U.S. foreign policy. And correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. O'Hagan, this is where Wilson comes out and basically states that we're going to be in the same chair again in 20 years with another world war brewing that's going to be even more technologically advanced.
Yes, yeah, he does absolutely kind of warn that failing to join the League at this time is setting the stage for a bigger conflict. Now, we didn't call it World War II.
Sure.
But in essence, he was predicting that ahead of time. And, it's intriguing because it was said at the time and even later that it wasn't so much the Senate that defeated the Treaty of Versailles as it was men like Washington and Monroe. So a suggestion that America's longstanding position as a neutral nation was the comfortable and familiar position. It's been said that the Treaty of Versailles wasn't really defeated by the Senate, but in fact it was rejected by Washington and Monroe. And that's a suggestion that America's longstanding position as a neutral nation was the comfortable and familiar position that the public ultimately supported.
Well, the period from 1890 to 1920 is a fascinating study of how the U.S. evolved from a nation focused on domestic issues to one that actively engaged in international affairs. It raises questions about the responsibilities and consequences of such power.
My goodness, we can absolutely see so much of this history intertwined in modern day debates about America's position in the world. Trump's America First position has many elements of that steer clear of permanent alliances sentiment while advocating for economic exchange. Still, in the 21st century, it seems harder than ever to trade freely and not be involved in some form of political entanglement.
Absolutely. This evolution highlights the tensions between neutrality and interventionism that continues to shape U.S. foreign policy today. Well, that's all for today, folks. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to check out all the great videos, content spotlights, A Push on the Road segments, Jam on History, and podcasts right here on the U.S. History Underground YouTube channel. We'll see you next time.
Underground Army dismissed.